I didn't think much about the job when I accepted it. My last nursing position had ended abruptly, thanks to a round of budget cuts. Bills were piling up, and there were only so many shifts I could pick up as a temp. So, when the ad popped up for an overnight nurse position at a private care facility outside Boston, I called immediately. The interviewer didn't even ask many questions, just if I could handle long shifts and if I was comfortable working in unusual environments. Unusual? Sure. I'd worked in ICU wards, assisted living homes, and even one stint at a hospice. Nothing fazed me anymore. When I pulled into the parking lot of Danvers State Hospital, I started to wonder if maybe I'd made a mistake. Danvers looked like something out of a horror movie. The building loomed over me like a giant tombstone. Gray stone walls, towers that reached into the overcast sky, and windows that seemed to stare back. I'd read about the place before. It opened in the 1800s as a psychiatric hospital, but like most of these places, it fell apart in the 20th century. Stories about overcrowding, mistreatment, and mysterious deaths made it famous for all the wrong reasons. The hospital had been mostly abandoned for decades, but apparently, one wing was still operational. I had to wonder who thought it was a good idea to keep anything running here. The parking lot was empty, except for a single black sedan idling near the entrance. I parked next to it and climbed the cracked stone steps, my breath fogging up in the cold October air. Inside, it was no better. The air smelled damp, like mildew and cleaning supplies, and the tile floor had a sticky, uneven feel beneath my sneakers. I followed a set of faded signs to the nurse's station, where I found a man in a rumpled sweater flipping through a clipboard. "Ah, you must be Colburn," he said, glancing up at me. "That's me," I replied. "Ethan Colburn. You must be—" "Dr. Martin Greaves," he said quickly, handing me the clipboard. He looked tired, deep shadows under his eyes, a 5 o'clock shadow that looked like it had overstayed its welcome, and a slight twitch to his movements. "You're here for the night shift." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. "This wing is Ward C2, he said. "It houses 5 patients. Long-term cases, catatonic. No movement, no verbal responses. Stable, as long as the environment is controlled. Your job is to monitor them, follow the schedule, and most importantly," he tapped the clipboard for emphasis, "follow the rules." I glanced at the clipboard, skimming the first page. A basic schedule and emergency protocols. But on the second page, in bold letters, was a title that made my stomach twist. Rules for Ward C2. Read carefully. The list was short, but strange. 1. Check room 3 first every hour. If the patient is sitting up, leave immediately and report it to the doctor. Do not re-enter until instructed. 2. Never clean the mirrors in the common area. Let them gather dust. If you see them shine, leave the ward for exactly 13 minutes. 3. If you hear someone humming near room 5, do not look inside. Instead, hum back the tune softly until the sound fades. 4. Lock the medicine cabinet at 1 a.m. If it's unlocked by 1:30, count the bottles. There should always be 20. If there are fewer, do not touch the cabinet again. 5. The elevator to the basement will sometimes arrive empty. If it opens on its own, close the doors and press 4. Do not look inside, no matter what you hear. "Seriously?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Dr. Greaves said flatly. "Seriously." I waited for the punchline, but it didn't come. He just stared at me with those tired, bloodshot eyes, like he was daring me to laugh. "This facility is old," he said after a long pause. "Certain things, patterns, need to be maintained. If they're not, the patient's conditions may deteriorate severely." There was something in his tone that sent a chill up my spine. "I've worked in psych wards before," I said. "I think I can handle it." Dr. Greaves sighed, rubbing his temples like he'd heard this before. "Just follow the rules, Mr. Colburn. No exceptions." He led me down the hall to the patient rooms, explaining as we went. The 5 rooms were in a row, each with heavy steel doors and small observation windows. Room 1 held an elderly man with paper-thin skin and sunken eyes. He lay perfectly still, his chest barely rising with each breath. Room 2 housed a young woman, maybe 25, with skin so pale you could trace the veins beneath it. The feeding tube taped to her cheek seemed to be the only thing anchoring her to this world. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at the ceiling as if she could see something beyond it that we couldn't. Room 3. I barely caught a glimpse before Dr. Greaves moved us along. He didn't stop, didn't explain. Just kept walking like he couldn't get away fast enough. Room 4 was a man in his 40s, his long, greasy hair hiding most of his face. He lay on his back with his hands folded neatly over his chest, like someone had posed him that way. Room 5's observation window was covered from the inside with cardboard. "Why's room 5 blocked?" I asked. Dr. Greaves didn't answer right away. "She's sensitive," he said finally. "Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." Fine. Sure. Nothing about this place felt fine. Dr. Greaves left just before midnight, leaving me alone with the faint hum of fluorescence and the steady beep of a few distant monitors. "Follow the rules," he'd said, before walking out. "No exceptions." At first, everything seemed fine. I made my rounds, checking each room as instructed. Room 3 was exactly as I'd seen it, the patient flat on his back, unmoving. Room 5 stayed silent. The medicine cabinet was locked. By 12:30, I started to relax. The rules seemed strange, sure, but the patients weren't doing anything unusual. And then, at 12:45, I heard it. A faint humming. It was coming from room 5. By 12:45, I started to hear the humming. It was faint at first, like someone humming a lullaby from far down the hall. I thought it might be a monitor beeping out of tune, or maybe the wind slipping through the cracks in the building. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. A soft, rising and falling melody. It was coming from room 5. I froze outside the door. My clipboard felt suddenly heavy in my hands, the edge biting into my palm. The rule about room 5 jumped to the front of my mind. If you hear someone humming near room 5, do not look inside. Instead, hum back the tune softly until the sound fades. My brain scrambled for an explanation. The patient in room 5 was supposed to be catatonic. Dr. Greaves hadn't even mentioned her name. And yet, I could hear it clearly. A woman's voice, sweet and steady, humming like she had all the time in the world. My first instinct was to peek through the observation window. Just a quick look to make sure she was okay. But then I remembered Dr. Greaves' warning. Follow the rules. No exceptions. I swallowed hard and began to hum back. My voice cracked at first. It felt ridiculous, humming along to an invisible lullaby in the middle of an empty ward. But the moment my voice joined hers, the humming on the other side of the door began to soften. I kept humming, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound. Slowly, the melody faded into silence. The air felt heavy. My ears strained against the quiet, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But room 5 stayed silent. I let out a shaky breath and stumbled back to the nurse's station, my knees weak. The clipboard rules had felt absurd when I first read them, but now they felt like a lifeline. Whatever was going on in room 5, I didn't want to know. The rest of the night passed without incident. I made my rounds, checked the medicine cabinet, still locked, and tried not to think about how loud my footsteps sounded on the tile. By 7 a.m., the faint glow of daylight began seeping through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, and I breathed easier. When Dr. Greaves returned, I wanted to ask him about the humming. Wanted to demand answers. But the words stuck in my throat. "Good," he said, glancing over the clipboard where I'd logged each round. "You followed the rules." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't reassuring. "You'll get used to it," he added, and I wasn't sure if it was meant as encouragement or a warning. Night 2 started the same way. Quiet, uneventful, and far too cold for comfort. I was prepared this time, or at least, I thought I was. I made my rounds on the hour, moving quickly through each room. Room 3 was exactly as I'd left it the night before. The patient flat on his back, unmoving, his face a blank mask. But at 2:15 a.m., something changed. I was finishing my notes at the nurse's station when the elevator dinged. My head snapped up. Dr. Greaves hadn't mentioned anyone else working the night shift, and as far as I knew, I was completely alone in the ward. The sound of the elevator echoed down the hall, unnervingly loud against the silence. I walked toward it cautiously, the clipboard tucked under my arm. When I rounded the corner, I saw the elevator doors standing open, the fluorescent light inside casting harsh shadows across the floor. The elevator was empty. My pulse quickened as I stared at the open doors. Another rule surfaced in my mind. The elevator to the basement will sometimes arrive empty. If it opens on its own, close the doors and press 4. Do not look inside, no matter what you hear. I hesitated, listening. At first there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft rustling noise, like fabric brushing against metal. My chest tightened. It felt like the elevator itself was waiting, inviting me to step closer. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I reached out and pressed the close door button. The rustling stopped instantly, replaced by a low creak as the doors slid shut. My thumb hovered over the buttons, and I pressed 4 as instructed. The elevator hummed softly, its lights dimming for a brief moment before the doors reopened. The hallway was empty. I stepped back, my skin prickling as I walked away. For the rest of the night, I avoided going near the elevator, my ears straining for any sign of it returning. By the time morning came, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. When Dr. Greaves arrived, I asked him about the elevator. "It's an old system," he said vaguely, avoiding my eyes. "It doesn't always respond the way you'd expect. That's why the rules exist, to keep you safe." Safe from what? I wanted to ask. But I already knew I wouldn't get a real answer. Instead, I nodded and handed him the clipboard. He glanced over my notes, his expression neutral. Then, after a moment, he said, "Good. You followed the rules." It sounded like relief. The next few nights passed in much the same way, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the ward was watching me. The rules had started to feel less like guidelines and more like a conversation. A set of instructions meant to keep me one step ahead of something I couldn't see. Room 3 was always the same. The patient flat on his back, his expression unchanging. But sometimes, when I walked past, I thought I heard faint creaks coming from the bed, like someone shifting their weight. The mirrors in the common area stayed dull and dusty, but I avoided looking at them directly, just in case. And room 5. The humming returned every night, always at different times, always fading when I hummed back. It never lasted long, but each time, I felt like I was losing a small piece of myself, like the melody was worming its way into my head. By the end of my 4th shift, I wasn't sure what scared me more, breaking the rules, or the possibility that following them might not be enough. By the time night 4 rolled around, I felt like a prisoner in my own skin. The asylum had seeped into me. Its cold halls, the stale air, and those damned rules. I followed them like gospel, because I didn't want to know what would happen if I didn't. But the rules had started to gnaw at me, as if they were daring me to break them. I started my rounds just like every night. Room 1 was silent, the elderly man as still as ever. Room 2's patient stared blankly at the ceiling, unblinking. Room 3. God, room 3. I never lingered there longer than I had to. The man hadn't moved since my first shift, but every time I peeked through the observation window, I swore the air in the room felt heavier. Room 4 was fine, if you could call it that. The man with the greasy hair hadn't shifted an inch. His chest rose and fell so faintly it was hard to tell if he was breathing or something pretending to breathe. And then, room 5. The humming started as I approached the door. It was louder this time, the tune more complex, with a strange, off-key rhythm that made my skin crawl. I paused outside the door, clipboard in hand, the melody wrapping around me like a cold wind. I knew what I had to do. I'd done it every night. But this time, I hesitated. What would happen if I didn't hum back? The thought hit me like a brick, and I shoved it down hard. There was no way I was testing the rules. Not with room 5. I hummed the tune softly, my voice shaking, and the sound on the other side of the door began to fade. But this time, it didn't stop completely. It lingered, a faint echo that didn't quite leave my ears, even as I walked back to the nurse's station. At 2:10 a.m., the elevator dinged. I froze in my chair, the clipboard slipping from my lap. I hadn't gone near it since the second night. The memory of those open doors, the faint rustling sound from within. It still clawed at my brain. The elevator dinged again, and I heard the doors slide open. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the arms of my chair, trying to convince myself to stay put. I didn't need to check it. I could just wait for the doors to close on their own. That's what I should have done. But then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, muffled by the distance, but I could swear it was calling my name. Ethan. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't even sound particularly menacing. It was soft, familiar, almost friendly. I rose to my feet, my legs stiff and heavy, and walked toward the sound before I could stop myself. When I turned the corner, the elevator was waiting. The doors were open, the light inside flickering faintly. Ethan, the voice called again, drifting up from somewhere deep below. It was impossible, but it felt like the sound was coming from the basement. My hand moved to the close door button, trembling, but I didn't press it. Instead, I leaned forward, peering into the elevator. I didn't mean to. I just couldn't help it. The flickering light cast shifting shadows against the walls, making it hard to focus. And then, in the far corner, I saw it. A faint handprint, smeared in something dark and wet. The elevator groaned, its lights dimming for a moment, and my breath hitched. Close the doors. Press 4. The rule rang out in my mind like a lifeline, breaking through the haze. I slammed my hand against the button, my finger jabbing it over and over until the doors finally slid shut. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed 4, and the elevator jolted slightly, as if shaking off whatever had been inside. I didn't look back. At 3 a.m., everything went quiet. The faint hum of the fluorescents, the distant beeping of monitors. It all stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. I sat frozen at the nurse's station, my ears straining for any sound, any sign of life. And then I heard the knock. It came from down the hall, faint but deliberate. 3 slow taps against one of the metal doors. Room 3. I didn't move. My body felt like stone, my heart pounding against my ribs. The rule for room 3 echoed in my mind. If the patient is sitting up, leave immediately and report it to the doctor. Do not re-enter until instructed. I wanted to believe I'd imagined the sound. But then it came again, louder this time. The air in the hallway felt colder as I approached room 3, each step heavier than the last. My breath fogged in front of me as I peered through the observation window. The patient was sitting up. He was perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting neatly on his knees. His head was tilted slightly to the side, and his eyes, open, dark, and unblinking, were fixed on the door. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. His mouth moved, just barely, but enough. He was whispering something. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I could see his lips forming them over and over, slow and deliberate. The clipboard slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. And then his head turned. Not slowly, not naturally. His head snapped toward me, his eyes locking onto mine with impossible speed. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. "Dr. Greaves," I stammered into the radio, my voice trembling. "Room 3. The patient. He's sitting up." The radio crackled faintly, but no response came. The radio remained silent, the static hissing faintly in the quiet. "Dr. Greaves," I barked again, my voice rising. "Do you copy? Room 3. Something's wrong." Nothing. I clutched the radio tighter, my knuckles white, my thumb hovering over the button like it might force him to respond. But the static never changed, and the patient in room 3 never moved again. He just stared at the door, his head cocked at that impossible angle, whispering. I stumbled back toward the nurse's station, my breaths shallow and uneven. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to grab my keys, sprint out the door, and never look back. But the rules held me in place. I grabbed the clipboard from the desk, my eyes scanning the instructions for something I'd missed. If the patient is sitting up, leave immediately and report it to the doctor. I had done that. I had followed the rule. But Dr. Greaves wasn't answering. What now? The silence in the ward pressed down on me like a weight, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what would happen if I left the building. If I broke the most basic unwritten rule, stay. The thought twisted in my gut. Something told me that leaving wouldn't be the end of it. At 3:45 a.m., the mirrors in the common area began to shine. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye. A faint gleam reflecting the pale light of the fluorescents. The clipboard hit the desk with a dull thud as I stood, my legs moving before my brain caught up. I stepped into the common area, the air colder now, my breath visible in the dim glow. The mirrors were covered in dust, layers of it, thick and gray. I'd avoided looking at them all week, but now, the surface of one shone faintly, as though someone had taken a rag and wiped a clean circle in the center. I stared at it, my body frozen, a sharp edge of panic crawling up my spine. Never clean the mirrors in the common area. Let them gather dust. If you see them shine, leave the ward for exactly 13 minutes. The rule hit me like a hammer. My feet itched to move, to bolt for the front door and stay outside until the clock ticked past 4 o'clock. But something held me in place. Something cold and unseen, like a hand pressed to my chest. The shining circle in the mirror began to expand, the light growing brighter, spreading outward like a ripple on water. And then, in the center of the glass, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't right. It stood in the exact same spot as me, but its head tilted slightly, its expression empty. The longer I stared, the more wrong it became. Its movements were out of sync, lagging just behind mine, like an old video with the audio mismatched. I raised a hand slowly, testing it, and my reflection hesitated before mirroring the gesture. Its lips twitched into a smile I didn't make. Something deep and instinctive roared to life in my chest, and I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the desk. The reflection stepped forward. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran. The air outside the ward hit me like a slap, cold and biting. My hands fumbled for my phone, desperate to check the time. 3:51 a.m. I leaned against the stone wall of the building, gasping for breath, the glow of the front entrance faint behind me. 13 minutes. That was all I needed to wait. The rules hadn't let me down yet. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity. My eyes darted to the windows, but the lights inside the ward seemed dimmer now, as though the building itself was fading into shadow. At 4 a.m. sharp, I stepped back inside. The hallway was dark. The fluorescents, which had been humming weakly just minutes ago, had gone out completely, leaving the ward bathed in an eerie twilight. Something was wrong. I didn't have time to think before the elevator dinged again. The sound jolted me like an electric shock, my stomach twisting painfully. I backed away from the sound, my shoes squeaking faintly on the tile. The hallway stretched out before me, the elevator doors faintly visible at the far end. This time, they didn't open. Instead, the sound came again. 3 slow knocks. Not from room 3 this time, from the elevator doors. I clutched the clipboard tighter, my nails digging into the wood. The doors slid open slowly, and my blood turned to ice. The elevator was empty, but in the center of the floor lay a single bottle of pills, its label smudged and unreadable. I stared at it, my brain screaming at me to follow the rules, to press 4 and walk away. But something in my chest shifted, something deep and angry. I stepped into the elevator. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me, and the lights inside flickered violently. The air felt heavy, pressing in from all sides, and I realized too late that I'd broken the rule. The elevator began to move. Downward. The elevator groaned as it descended, the ancient gears grinding like the machine was trying to resist. I stood frozen in the corner, my back pressed against the cold metal wall, watching the flickering lights above me. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of mildew and something sharper, metallic, like rust or blood. I reached for the panel, jabbing the 4 button desperately, but it didn't respond. The button didn't even light up. The elevator shuddered violently, and a low hum filled the space, rising in pitch until it became a high-pitched whine that drilled into my skull. "Stop!" I yelled, slamming my hand against the door. "Let me out." The whine stopped abruptly. Then a voice, faint and distorted, coming from all directions at once. "You broke the rule, Ethan." My breath hitched. It wasn't just any voice. It was mine. The elevator jolted to a halt, the sudden stillness worse than the motion. The doors creaked open, revealing a pitch-black hallway beyond. I hesitated, gripping the sides of the doorway like they might hold me back. But there was nowhere else to go. The hallway stretched out into the darkness, its walls damp and crumbling. The faint outline of an old, rusted wheelchair sat just beyond the light of the elevator, its wheels crooked and unmoving. I stepped out cautiously, the sound of my shoes echoing on the wet floor. The darkness seemed to pull at me, wrapping around my skin like a living thing. Behind me, the elevator doors slid shut with a hollow clang, and the faint hum of the machinery faded into silence. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I fumbled for my phone, flipping on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, revealing more of the decrepit hallway. There were doors on either side, their rusted frames barely holding onto warped wooden panels. Most were sealed tight, but one stood ajar, its hinges sagging under its own weight. The air grew colder the closer I got to it. My breath fogged in front of me, and the metallic scent grew stronger. I reached for the door, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The flashlight beam wavered as my hands began to shake. Inside was a small room, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of ancient medical supplies. In the center of the room sat a metal operating table, its surface streaked with dark stains that had long since dried, and on the floor, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to the table, were more pill bottles. 20, I realized. 20 bottles. The medicine cabinet's contents. I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. Something shifted in the corner of the room. I turned the flashlight toward it, the beam landing on a figure crouched in the shadows. At first, it didn't move. Its limbs were long and thin, its skin pale and glistening in the light. Then it raised its head. I stumbled back, the beam trembling in my hand. It wasn't just pale. It was me. The face staring back at me was mine, but wrong. The features were stretched, the eyes hollow and black, the mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that showed rows of teeth too sharp to be human. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice wet and bubbling, like it was speaking through water. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It stood slowly, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on fraying strings. "You're not supposed to be here," it said. The lights in the room flickered violently, and the air seemed to fold in on itself, pressing against my chest. The thing took a step closer, and its shadow stretched across the walls, towering over me. I ran. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, my feet slamming against the wet floor as I bolted back into the hallway. The darkness seemed thicker now, the shadows shifting and writhing as if they were alive. Behind me, I heard it coming. The sound of bare feet slapping against the ground, slow and deliberate. "Ethan," it called again, its voice echoing through the hallway. "You broke the rule." I didn't stop. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I kept running, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on and on no matter how far I ran. Doors blurred past me, and the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, now impossibly close. I stumbled, my shoulder slamming into the wall. The flashlight fell from my hand, skittering across the floor, its beam spinning wildly before coming to a stop. The light landed on a door at the end of the hallway. A large, rusted plaque above it read, "Ward C2. My ward." I threw myself at the door, yanking it open with trembling hands. The moment I stepped through, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the voice, it all vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescence overhead. I was back in the ward. The hallway was just as I'd left it, silent and empty. My watch read 4:15 a.m., but it felt like hours had passed. I stumbled back to the nurse's station, my body trembling, my mind racing. The clipboard was still there, sitting neatly on the desk, the rules staring back at me like they'd been waiting. And then I saw it. A new rule had been added, written in bold, fresh ink. Rule 6. Once you've been to the basement, the rules no longer apply. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at the clipboard. The ink on the new rule looked wet, the words shimmering faintly under the fluorescent lights. Once you've been to the basement, the rules no longer apply. The meaning hit me like a punch to the gut. The rules had been the only thing keeping me safe, the only barrier between me and whatever this place really was. Without them, I was exposed. I grabbed the clipboard, my fingers trembling, and scanned the other rules, hoping for some kind of loophole. But the words seemed to shift and blur as I looked at them, twisting into something unrecognizable. The ward was silent, too silent. I forced myself to move, walking down the hall to begin my next round. Room 1 was empty. I stopped in my tracks, my heart lurching painfully in my chest. The bed was neatly made, the sheets smoothed flat, but the elderly man who had been lying there just an hour ago was gone. The air in the room felt cold, heavier than before, and the faint smell of mildew made my stomach churn. I backed out slowly, turning toward room 2. It too was empty. The young woman's feeding tube lay coiled neatly on the bed, the IV stand standing like a sentinel by the window. Panic clawed at my throat as I moved to room 3, dreading what I'd find. The door was slightly ajar, the observation window fogged over from the inside. I pushed it open carefully, my breath catching in my chest. The patient was gone, but the bed wasn't empty. Sitting neatly on the mattress was the clipboard. It was identical to the one I'd left on the nurse's station. Same faded paper, same faint coffee stain on the corner. But this one was blank, save for a single line of text written in large, uneven letters. "You're next." I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. The air felt thick, pressing against my lungs, and a faint ringing filled my ears. Somewhere behind me, I heard the hum of the elevator. I turned slowly, my legs weak and trembling. The elevator doors stood open at the far end of the hall, casting a faint light across the floor. The ringing in my ears grew louder as I stared into the empty cabin. But it wasn't empty. A figure stood inside, shrouded in shadow. Its body was still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, but I didn't need to see its face to know who it was. It was me. The figure raised a hand slowly, its movements jerky and deliberate, and beckoned me forward. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The hallway seemed to stretch and warp around me, the walls curving inward, like the throat of some great beast. The lights flickered, and the figure took a step out of the elevator, its shadow stretching toward me like a living thing. The humming started again. Soft at first, then louder, echoing through the hall like a choir of voices, all singing the same broken tune. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, the cold tile biting into my skin. The figure was closer now, its grin wide and unnatural, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice overlapping with the humming. "You broke the rule." It reached for me, its hand impossibly long and pale, and I felt the cold touch of its fingers wrap around my wrist. The world spun, the walls melting into darkness, and the last thing I saw was its face. My face, grinning down at me with teeth that weren't mine. I woke up in my car. The morning sun was blinding, its warmth a sharp contrast to the cold sweat clinging to my skin. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. A vivid, twisted nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But when I looked at the passenger seat, I saw it. The clipboard. It was sitting there, the edges worn and the paper smudged. But the text was clear. Rule 6. Once you've been to the basement, the rules no longer apply. I should have driven away. I should have left Danvers behind. But I couldn't stop thinking about the patients, or Dr. Greaves. What had happened to them? The patients' faces lingered in my mind. The elderly man in room 1, the pale young woman in room 2, the greasy-haired man in room 4. They were gone. Not transferred. Not discharged. Gone. And Dr. Greaves? He hadn't answered the radio. He hadn't been there when I needed him. I could still hear his voice, clipped and tired. Follow the rules. No exceptions. Had he been following them too? Or had he already broken them? I see them sometimes. The patients, Dr. Greaves, shadows and reflections, glimpses of faces in darkened windows, and the humming. God, the humming. It follows me everywhere now, soft and sweet, like it's lulling me back to sleep. I don't know if Dr. Greaves is dead. I don't even know if he was ever alive. The rules were never meant to protect me. They were only meant to hold something back. And now, without them, it's here. Danvers didn't let me go. It let me bring it with me.